Welcome to Libeth. Every text operates on at least two levels simultaneously, but not every text makes productive use of the gap between them. Tales of Old Japan is a book that makes extraordinary productive use of that gap. So much so that what the book appears to be about and what it is actually about are almost entirely different things, and the most important meanings are the ones that never appear on the surface at all. On the surface, this is a book about Japan, about samurai and vendetta and supernatural creatures and Buddhist ceremonies and the extraordinary ritual of seppuku. This is what the Victorian reader received, what they were looking for, what the market for exotic Eastern curiosity demanded. But underneath that surface runs an argument about England, about what Victorian modernity had lost and what it should still want, about the relationship between honor and law, about whether community can survive the dissolution of the shared ethical framework that gave community its meaning. Mitford was writing about Japan and thinking about England simultaneously, and the book's power, its lasting power, the power that made it formative rather than merely entertaining, comes from the precision with which it manages that double operation. The literal layer of the text is substantial and should not be dismissed. The tales of vendetta and loyalty are historically grounded. The 47 Ronin story is based on actual events. The legal procedures Mitford describes in his essay on vendetta were real institutional practices of the Tokugawa state. The seppuku he witnessed happened. The supernatural tales are drawn from genuine oral tradition, not invented for foreign consumption. The Buddhist and ceremonial descriptions reflect practices that were actually observed. Mitford was not fabricating Japan. He had real access, real knowledge, real skill as an observer, and he deployed all of those resources honestly. The literal layer holds. The problem is not that the literal layer is false. The problem is that the literal layer does not exist in isolation from the figurative one, and the figurative one is shaped by forces that have nothing to do with Japan. The figurative layer of the 47 Ronin story is where the Victorian argument becomes visible. The tale demonstrates, with the narrative completeness of a proof, that loyalty is worth dying for, not in the abstract, not as a sentiment, but as a concrete practice that reorganizes every aspect of a person's life and demands everything, including life itself, in the end. The Victorian reader, who received this demonstration, was not receiving an anthropological curiosity about Japanese customs. They were receiving an argument directed at their own moment, their own civilization, their own increasingly instrumental relationship to obligation and community. England in 1871 was industrializing at a pace that was dissolving exactly the kinds of community, the village, the guild, the parish, the feudal household, that the samurai world represented to the Victorian imagination. The loyalty that the Ronin practice is the loyalty of people who belong to something larger than themselves, whose identity is constituted by their obligations rather than by their preferences. The Victorian reader, living in a world increasingly organized around individual preference and commercial exchange, found this both alien and yearned for. Not alien and admirable, in the way that a foreign custom is admirable while remaining foreign. Alien and admirable in the way that a lost home is admirable, recognizable, desired, no longer available. This is the logic of nostalgia as an ideological instrument. Mitford did not invent the comparison between Japanese Bushido and European chivalry. The comparison was already circulating in the diplomatic and travel literature of the period, but he gave it its most powerful and durable form. The explicit parallel that appears in the book, Japanese honor is like English chivalry, but intact where English chivalry is vestigial, is doing several kinds of work at once. It makes Japan legible by translating it into a European framework. It flatters Japan by placing it in a tradition that European culture regards as noble. And it shames England by pointing to the living version of something that England has allowed to deteriorate. The Japan of the book is not simply interesting. It is reproachful. It is the mirror in which England sees what it has ceased to be. The figurative meaning of seppuku operates differently because the ritual is so far from anything in the Victorian reader's experience that simple analogical translation is not available. You cannot say seppuku is like something English and have the comparison work. What Mitford does instead is describe it with extraordinary precision and without the protective buffer of moral commentary, and then allow the reader to sit with what they have just been shown. What seppuku means figuratively, what it means as an argument rather than as a description, is that the body is the last site of self-determination in a world organized by obligation. When every other form of agency has been removed, when the condemned man is in the hands of the state, when the legal verdict is final, when there is nothing left to choose, the ritual form of death is the one thing that remains in the dying man's control. He chooses how to die. He chooses the form of his dying. And in choosing that form, in performing it with precision and composure, he asserts a claim about who he was that no external authority can revoke. The self is expressed most completely at the moment of its termination. The dying man is the freest man in the room. This is a disturbing idea for a Victorian audience shaped by Protestant Christianity, which reserves the authority over death to God and treats suicide as a sin regardless of its motivation or form. The seppuku account places the British reader in direct confrontation with a civilization that organized the relationship between the self and death on entirely different premises, and does so not through philosophical argument, but through witnessed reality. Mitford was there. He saw it. He is describing what he saw. The reader cannot dismiss it as theory. And the man who performed the ritual, as Mitford describes him, was not desperate or broken or defeated. He was composed, deliberate, and in control, more in control, arguably, than anyone else in the room. The figurative meaning that radiates from this description is not that Japan is a civilization that accepts death, but that Japan is a civilization that has understood something about the relationship between form and meaning that Protestant rationalism has foreclosed. The ritual is not primitive. It is sophisticated. It transforms the involuntary event of dying into a voluntary act of self-definition. The supernatural tales carry a different figurative weight, one that is less about honor and more about the nature of the world itself. They establish, at the level of cosmology rather than ethics, that Japan is not simply Proto-European, not simply a civilization that has developed the same basic rational organization of reality, but in an unfamiliar cultural idiom. The Tengu, the goblin cat, the ghost demanding completion, these figures describe a world in which the boundary between the natural and supernatural is porous, in which forces move through the visible world that are not captured by the vocabulary of cause and effect that Victorian scientific rationalism had made the only legitimate way of describing reality. The figurative meaning of this, for the British reader, is not an invitation to believe in mountain spirits. It is an invitation to consider that the Western rationalist tradition may have foreclosed something important when it drew a sharp line between the world that reason can describe and everything that exists beyond that description. Japan, in these tales, is a civilization that has kept that boundary porous, that has maintained a relationship with the invisible that Protestant modernity had abandoned. The disappearing world that the book describes, and it describes it in every tale, even when that disappearance is not the explicit subject, connects at the figurative level to a much broader Victorian anxiety about what modernity was costing. Mitford knew he was documenting something that was ending. The Meiji government was actively dismantling the institutions his book was preserving. And this knowledge gives every piece in the collection an elegiac undertone that is not explicitly stated, but is structurally present throughout. The tales are not simply tales. They are the cultural products of a world that had already begun to understand itself as historical, as something that would need to be remembered rather than lived. And the British reader of 1871, watching their own world transform under the pressure of industrialization and urbanization at a speed that previous generations would have found incomprehensible, could feel the homology. The samurai world was not alien in its disappearance. It was familiar, a mirror for the British reader's own experience of watching the world of their parents and grandparents become something you could only find in books. The philosophical undertones of the book deserve more attention than they typically receive. The central philosophical argument, present in the Ronin story, in the seppuku account, in the legal essays, and in the cosmological frame of the supernatural tales, is that honor and law are not the same thing, and that the gap between them is where the most important human questions live. The Ronin broke the law to fulfill honor, and the moral arithmetic of the tale vindicates them. They were right, even though the legal system that condemned them was also right, which is to say that the legal system and the moral order can be simultaneously correct and in conflict. This is a position that Victorian liberalism had difficulty accommodating, because Victorian liberalism tended to treat the legal system as the expression of the moral order, the institutional encoding of what civilization had collectively decided was right. The Ronin story says no. The legal system and the moral order can diverge, and when they do, the moral order has priority, even though enforcing that priority costs everything. Connected to this is the book's sustained implicit argument about the communal versus the individual as the basic unit of ethical life. The Japanese ethical world Mitford describes is relational all the way down. There is no self that exists prior to or independent of its obligations. No individual who first establishes their own existence and then decides what obligations to take on, as Enlightenment political philosophy imagined. The self is constituted by its relations, which means that obligations are not burdens imposed on a pre-existing self, but the very material out of which selfhood is made. This is not an abstract philosophical claim in the book. It is demonstrated concretely, repeatedly, in the specific ways that characters make decisions. The Ronin leader does not weigh his personal interests against his obligations and decide his obligations matter more. His obligations are what he is. There is no weighing, because there are not two separate things on the scale. This picture of the self as fundamentally relational, as something that exists only within and through obligation, is the deepest challenge the book poses to its Victorian audience, and it is the challenge that the audience was least equipped to recognize as a challenge rather than simply as an interesting cultural difference. The book's philosophical work is most concentrated in what it refuses to resolve. It does not tell the reader whether the vendetta system is just. It describes it, provides its legal framework, dramatizes its most celebrated instance, and moves on without verdict. It does not tell the reader whether the Western presence in Japan was beneficial or damaging. It describes the world it encountered without analyzing the treaty structure that made that encounter possible. It does not tell the reader what to think about seppuku, whether it is dignified or barbarous, whether it represents a higher or a lower form of civilization's relationship to death. It gives you the account and leaves you with the question. These refusals are not evasions. They are the book's epistemological position, an implicit argument that the most important questions do not have answers that can be delivered from the outside. That judgment on the deepest matters of cultural difference requires a form of engagement that mere documentation cannot provide. Mitford is doing something rare for his period. He is building into the structure of his text an acknowledgement that his position as observer does not give him the authority to verdict. That's all for today on Libeth. One new book every week. At least we try.